Miss, the fare is $2.25. I cannot let you ride. That sentence, 8 words, delivered without eye contact, without hesitation, without a single glance at the belly that was 7 months full and pressing against the thin fabric of a winter coat that had never been warm enough for a Chicago February. The man behind the wheel said those 8 words the way a machine issues an error code, flat, final, and completely indifferent to what it cost the person receiving it. Zariah Webb stood in the doorway of Route 63 southbound, one hand gripping the metal rail, the other pressed against her stomach. The snow had been coming down since 3 p.m. It was now 4:49. She had been on her feet since 6 in the morning, had taken 3 buses to get to her prenatal appointment at Malcolm X College's affiliated clinic, had waited 40 minutes because the doctor was running behind, had been told that everything looked good, and that had been the first piece of good news she had received in weeks. She was holding on to that. She was holding on to it tightly. She reached the fare box. She tapped her Ventra card. The screen blinked red. Insufficient fare. She checked her coat pocket. A quarter, 2 dimes, a penny, 46 cents. She needed 75 more. She held the coins toward the fare box the way a person holds something fragile, carefully, as if the angle might matter. The driver's name was Floyd Emmett. He had been operating Route 63 for 14 years. He looked at the fare box display. He looked at the dashboard clock. The bus was already 4 minutes behind schedule, and Floyd Emmett's entire professional identity lived in the distance between where he was and where he was supposed to be. He did not look at the snow. He did not look at her stomach. He looked at the clock, and he said what he was trained to say. That was when Zariah said, quietly, without raising her voice, "I am 75 cents short. I just need to get home." And Floyd Emmett said, "I understand, but I cannot override the system." He pulled the lever. The doors opened outward. The cold came in. And somewhere in the back of the bus, a woman named Tamika Sewell opened her mouth and then closed it. The doors sealed shut. The bus rolled forward. And Zariah Webb stood on the sidewalk in 19-degree weather, snow settling on her shoulders, one hand on her stomach, watching the red taillights of Route 63 disappear around the corner of 55th and Halsted. At the far end of the block, another bus appeared in the gray distance, headlights cutting through the snow. It was not Route 63. Its route sign was dark, and as Zariah stood there watching, the lights went out entirely. The morning had started before the sun. Zariah had been up at 5:45 a.m., which was not unusual. She kept a small spiral notebook on the nightstand. Not a journal, nothing reflective, just a grid of times and bus numbers and transfer windows mapped out the night before. This was her system. She had built it out of necessity over the past 7 months, because when your nearest prenatal clinic requires 3 separate bus lines and 55 minutes of travel time in each direction, the margin for error collapses to nothing. One missed connection and the appointment is gone. One appointment gone and you are rescheduled 6 weeks out. 6 weeks out, when you are 7 months pregnant, is not the same as 6 weeks in any other context. She studied nursing at Malcolm X College on the West Side. Final year, she had held her GPA through the first trimester by studying on the bus, holding her textbooks in her lap, and reading about fluid dynamics in fetal development while the city moved past the windows. Her instructors knew she was pregnant. A few of them had adjusted her clinical rotation schedule. One had not. She had not complained about the one who had not, because complaining required energy she was saving for everything else. Her coat was a dark green quilted thing she had bought secondhand 2 winters ago, before the pregnancy, when it still zipped all the way up. Now the zipper stopped 6 inches short of closing. She had safety pinned the gap. The safety pin held. Most mornings, that was enough. She left the apartment at 6:25 a.m., descended 2 flights of stairs slowly. The center of gravity thing was real and recent. A physical negotiation she had to make with every surface that was not perfectly flat, and walk 3 blocks to the stop for the first bus. The temperature was 17 degrees at 6:25. The stop had no shelter. It had a pole and a sign, and the particular bleak quality of infrastructure that was designed to function rather than to be endured. The first bus came 4 minutes late. The second connection was tight, 8 minutes at the transfer point on Garfield, and she made it with 90 seconds to spare. The third bus smelled like the heating system was struggling, which it was, because this was Route 63, and things on Route 63 did not get repaired quickly. She stood for most of it. The seats near the front were taken, and she was not going to ask anyone to move. Not because she was proud, but because she had learned that asking people for things in small spaces produced a specific kind of discomfort that lingered long after the seat was offered or refused. The appointment was at 10 a.m. She arrived at 9:52, which meant she had enough time to check in, remove her coat, fold it over the back of the chair, and arrange the plastic bag she always carried to these visits. Her insurance card, her previous ultrasound printouts, a small list of questions written in the same compact handwriting she used for everything. The doctor was a woman named Dr. Paulette Henry, who ran behind schedule with the precision of someone who runs behind schedule as a matter of professional identity. She arrived at 10:38. The examination was thorough. The baby's position was good. The blood pressure reading was on the high side of normal. Dr. Henry said, "Manageable, but worth watching," and wrote something in the chart. She recommended that Zariah reduce her stress load. Zariah did not laugh. She wrote, "Reduce stress," in her notebook, because she wrote everything in her notebook, and then she drew a small question mark beside it, and then she closed the notebook. The good news was that everything, structurally and developmentally, looked right. The baby was growing the way a baby should grow. That was the piece she carried out of the clinic on a plastic bag loop around her wrist. Everything looked right. She had $54 in her checking account. She had spent $4.50 on bus fare getting to the clinic. She had $2.29 in her Venture card account, which she had verified that morning before leaving. $2.29. The fare was $2.25. She had done the math. She had 4 cents to spare. What she had not accounted for was the wind. Not the wind itself, but what the wind meant for the bus. Route 63 ran through a stretch of Garfield Boulevard that afternoon where a traffic reroute had pushed the buses off their usual line. Floyd Emmett, the afternoon driver, had made 2 unscheduled deviations to navigate the reroute. Each deviation cost him time. By the time his bus reached 55th and Halsted, he was 4 minutes behind schedule, which for Floyd Emmett was the equivalent of 4 inches of water in a basement. Not catastrophic yet, but rising and requiring immediate management. Floyd Emmett was 52 years old and had been driving for the Chicago Transit Authority for 14 years. He was not a cruel man. He was not, in any traditional sense, a bad man. He was a man who had been doing the same job in the same seat on the same route for so long that the job had reorganized him from the inside. He did not see passengers. He saw boarding events. He did not hear conversations. He heard scheduled deviations. His entire professional life had condensed into a single measurement: the gap between actual time and scheduled time. When the gap was 0, Floyd Emmett was at peace. When it was not 0, everything else became noise. He had a reputation at the depot on 77th Street. 14 years, and he had never once missed a scheduled endpoint. Drivers talked about that. It was the thing people said about Floyd Emmett when they said things about Floyd Emmett. Not that he was kind, not that passengers liked him, not that he went out of his way for anyone, but that he ran on time. That was the whole of it. The bus arrived at 55th and Halsted at 4:49 p.m., 4 minutes late. Floyd could feel the number sitting on his chest like something physical. Zariah stepped on. She tapped her card. The machine beeped. She held her coins toward the fare box. Floyd looked at the coins. He looked at the clock. He said the 8 words. Zariah said she was 75 cents short and just needed to get home. Floyd said he understood but could not override the system, and it was possible he even believed this, that what he was doing was not a choice, but a mechanical function of a system that could not be asked to bend. 18 people were on that bus. Tamika Sewell was in the third row, with her daughter on her lap and her son in the seat beside her. She was 38 years old and had transferred onto this bus at the previous stop. She had seen the card fail. She had seen the coins. She had been watching since Zariah stepped on, with the particular attention of a woman who knows exactly what it looks like to stand in a doorway with not enough and too much need. She opened her mouth. She had the word ready. It was a short word, just 2 syllables. Just wait. One word directed at Floyd, and she could have paid the 75 cents herself. She had it. She had counted it before Zariah boarded. She had confirmed it. But the word stopped somewhere between her chest and her throat, and Floyd pulled the lever, and the doors opened, and the cold came in, and nobody said anything. Zariah stepped down. She did not look back. The doors closed. The bus moved forward. Floyd checked his mirror and made a note in his head that he had made up one of the 4 minutes. On the sidewalk, at a bus stop that was a pole and a sign and nothing else. No shelter, no bench, no glass, no overhead covering. Zariah Webb stood in 19-degree air with one hand on her stomach and watched the taillights of Route 63 disappear. The wind came off the lake in the way Chicago wind comes off the lake in February, which is not the way wind works in most places. It does not gust, it presses. It finds the gaps in your coat and the space between your collar and your jaw, and it settles there, steady and indifferent. She had a small spiral notebook in her coat pocket. She pulled it out. She opened it to the day's page, where she had written the bus numbers and times that morning. She found the entry for the return trip. Route 63, 4:49 p.m., Unit 2847, Operator Floyd Emmett, Badge 4412. She had not known those last details this morning. She knew them now because she had looked at the bus number when she boarded, the way she always looked, the way she had trained herself to look at everything that could later matter. She added one line below the entry. She wrote the word refused. She wrote the amount. She wrote the time, 4:49 p.m. She wrote it in the same small, deliberate handwriting she used for everything, not shaking, not smearing, just clean lines on a grid. Then she put the notebook back in her pocket, put her hand back on her stomach, and stood in the snow and waited. If this story is already pulling you in, you are exactly where you should be. Consider subscribing. There is more coming, and it matters. Across the city, in an apartment in the Woodlawn neighborhood, a man named Otis Calloway had been home for exactly 53 minutes. He had worked the morning shift, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. on Route 63, and had come back to his apartment, made a sandwich with the last of the bread, and sat down at his kitchen table. The kitchen table was small. The apartment was small. But Otis had learned, over 41 years of living in spaces that fit what he could afford rather than what he needed, that the size of a space and its sufficiency were 2 separate measurements. He had been assigned Route 63 6 years ago when he was hired by the CTA after 11 months of warehouse work and a brief, undistinguished stint driving a delivery truck for a linen company that had folded on a Tuesday without telling its drivers until Wednesday morning. He had applied for the CTA position because it was steady, because it had benefits, real benefits, the kind with dental coverage and a pension, and because driving was the one thing he had always been genuinely good at. Not fast, not aggressive, just attentive. He checked his mirrors more often than most drivers check their phones. He kept both hands on the wheel with a naturalness that other operators sometimes found excessive. He waited the extra 3 seconds when he saw someone running for the stop. Route 63 was not a desirable assignment. Drivers with seniority transferred out the moment they had enough years to request a different line. The buses broke down more often. The stops had no shelters. The maintenance budget that was supposed to keep everything running on Route 63 moved in the same direction as every other public resource in the neighborhoods it served, slowly and to other places first. Otis had been offered a transfer twice. He had declined both times. He did not explain why to anyone at the depot. The reason was not complicated. The people on this route needed a bus that showed up consistently, and Otis Calloway was the kind of person who showed up. He knew his regulars not by name, but by pattern. There was an elderly woman, he did not know her name, had never asked, who boarded every Tuesday and Thursday at 7:10 a.m. from the stop at Halsted. She always carried a small bag, and she always held her left arm carefully against her side, protecting the place where the needle went in. She was going to dialysis. He knew because of the bag and the posture and the 2-day-a-week regularity of it. They had an arrangement that existed entirely in the space between a nod and a door opening on time. She would be there. He would wait the extra 2 seconds to make sure she was settled before pulling away. There was a young man who boarded at 63rd and Ashland 5 nights a week, 9:45 p.m., heading to a warehouse job in Pullman. Always tired, always polite. He wore headphones every ride, but the cord was never plugged into anything. He wore them so that people would not attempt conversation. Otis understood this. Sometimes silence is the only private space a person can afford. And there was a young woman, early 20s, 7 months pregnant as of recently, he estimated, who boarded every Friday afternoon at 55th and Halsted. She carried a clear plastic bag that looked like it came from a medical clinic. She sat in the front row, put one hand on her stomach, and watched the city through the window with an expression that was difficult to categorize. Not sad, not resigned. More like she was studying something that she intended to pass a test on later. He did not know her name. He did not know her story. But he had seen her every Friday for the past 2 months, and he had noticed, the way his mother had taught him to notice people, not past them, but through them, that she was carrying something considerably heavier than the bag on her wrist. On the seat beside him, every shift for 6 years, sat a folded jacket. A CTA jacket, navy blue, one size too large for him, placed there on his first day and never moved since. Nobody at the depot had ever asked about it. He had never explained it. It sat there the way some things sit, quietly, without urgency, waiting for a moment that had not arrived yet. 6 years of shifts. 6 years of routes and stops and doors opening and closing. 6 years of that jacket, folded on the seat beside him, never needed. He was eating his sandwich at the kitchen table when the dispatcher called at 3:22 p.m. The call was routine. Floyd Emmett had ended his shift early. The roads were deteriorating. He had logged the weather as a safety concern, and the depot needed a replacement driver to complete Route 63's afternoon runs. Otis was available. He always said yes to the call-in shifts. He said yes now. He drove to the depot on 77th Street, signed in, and pulled out on Route 63 southbound at 4:12 p.m., running 12 minutes behind Floyd's abandoned schedule. He saw her from 3 blocks away. Route 63 was moving through the 55th Street corridor at a careful pace. The snow had made the roads slick in the way Chicago roads get slick when the temperature drops fast after snowfall. Not icy yet, but making decisions in that direction. And Otis was watching the street the way he always watched it. Mirrors and asphalt and the spaces between parked cars where pedestrians sometimes appeared without warning. She was standing at the pole, the one at 55th and Halsted that had a Route 63 sign zip-tied to it at roughly chest height. A sign that had been there long enough that the zip ties had yellowed and the reflective coating on the numbers had started to peel. There was no shelter around the sign. There was no bench. There was nothing but the pole, and the sign, and the sidewalk and the snow that had been falling for the past 2 hours and was now settling on horizontal surfaces, on the tops of parked cars, on the edge of the curb, on the shoulders of a young woman standing with one hand pressed flat against her stomach. Otis recognized her before he could see her face clearly. He recognized the posture, the way she was standing with her weight shifted slightly to the left, the plastic bag hanging from her right wrist. It was the Friday afternoon passenger, the one who watched the city go past like she was memorizing it. He was 3 blocks from the next scheduled stop. Under CTA operating rules, Article 7, Section 4, operators were not permitted to make passenger stops at non-designated locations. The rule existed for a set of genuine reasons: traffic safety, schedule integrity, liability, and Otis knew those reasons because he had read the manual and because he operated in general as a person who understood why rules were written before deciding what to do about them. He thought about the rule. He thought about the schedule. He was already running behind, and an unscheduled stop would put him further behind, and the depot tracked these things precisely. He thought about the 6 years he had spent building the kind of employment record that meant something. Steady, clean, no complaints, no incidents. He thought about the pension, which vested in 4 more years, and about what a pension meant when you had grown up in a place where pensions were not something people assumed they would ever have. He thought about all of that in the space of approximately 4 seconds while the bus moved through the snow toward the intersection. Then he looked at her hand on her stomach. And he did not remember a specific memory. He remembered a shape. The shape of being 7 years old in East St. Louis, standing at a bus stop in the dark, watching headlights come toward him and keep going. The shape of being visible and not seen. The shape of being in the cold and watching warmth move past you without stopping. He pulled the lever. The doors opened. He reached across to the seat beside him. He picked up the jacket, the CTA jacket, navy blue, folded there on his first day 6 years ago, and he unfolded it. He stood up. He stepped off the bus. The cold was immediate and serious. 19 degrees, and he had left his jacket on the seat, which meant what was between him and the February air was a uniform shirt with the CTA logo on the left breast pocket and nothing else. He walked to where she was standing. She looked up at him. He put the jacket on her shoulders. She did not move. She looked at him with an expression that was not gratitude yet. It was something earlier than gratitude, the moment before you understand what has just happened and what it means. He said 2 things. He said the bus was warm. He said, "Come on." She said 2 things back, barely above a whisper. "Okay, thank you." He walked her to the bus. She stepped up the stairs carefully, the way she stepped up everything, slowly, with attention, negotiating the incline and her own shifted center of gravity. He followed her in. He sat back down behind the wheel. He pulled the lever. The doors closed. He did not log the stop. He did not enter a fare. He turned the heat dial to its maximum position and pulled Route 63 back into traffic. He was 14 minutes behind schedule now. He did not look at the clock. Zariah sat in the front row. The jacket was 3 sizes too large. The sleeves came past her wrists. The shoulders sat wide on her frame. It smelled like the bus, like the heater and the vinyl seats and the specific neutral scent of a person who has been doing honest work in a small enclosed space for a long time. She pulled it around herself, put both hands on her stomach, and looked out the window at the snow. Behind her, the bus was quiet. Not the normal quiet of a city bus, which is the quiet of people maintaining deliberate distance from one another. This was different. This was the quiet of people who had just witnessed something and were still processing what category to put it in. A young woman in the second row, 19, maybe 20, looked at Zariah sitting in the front in the oversized jacket and stood up without saying anything and moved 3 rows back so Zariah could be closer to the heating vent near the front. She did not explain the move. She just made it. An older man in the 5th row had been riding Route 63 for 4 years. He had seen Otis behind that wheel for as long as he had been riding this bus. He knew Otis the way regular passengers know their regular drivers, not as a person exactly, but as a fixed point. The driver who nodded, the driver who waited the extra seconds for someone running, the driver who always had that jacket folded on the seat beside him. The man had never thought about the jacket before. He was thinking about it now. He was looking at Otis through the rearview mirror, both hands on the wheel, eyes on the road, and the seat beside him empty for the first time in 4 years. Tamika Sewell was in the bus too. She had transferred at the previous stop. She had been on Floyd Emmett's bus. She had been there when the door opened. She had been there when Zariah stepped down. She had been there and she had the 75 cents and she had not said the word. Now she was here, on this bus, watching a different driver do the thing she had not done. And she was crying, not loudly, just tears on her face that she was not wiping away, because wiping them would require acknowledging them, and acknowledging them would require admitting what she had chosen on the other bus. She was not crying because it was sad. She was crying because she had watched a door close on another person and had not moved, and someone else had moved, had stopped a bus and stepped into the cold and given away the only warm thing he had. Her daughter was asleep on her lap. Her son was watching Zariah from his seat with the straightforward curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to look away from things that matter. A young man near the back of the bus had his headphones in. He had not seen any of it, not the stop, not the jacket, none of the preceding sequence. He just noticed after a few minutes of riding that the bus was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that does not happen on city buses without a reason. He took his headphones out. He looked around. He saw a pregnant woman in the front row wearing a jacket that was clearly not hers, clearly too large, clearly a driver's jacket. He did not know the story. He looked at the driver, broad-shouldered, both hands on the wheel, no jacket, a cold draft pressing through the worn seal on the driver's side window. He put his headphones in his lap. He kept them there for the rest of the ride. Otis did not turn around. He drove. The cold came through the window seal steadily, the way it always did on this bus, because the seal had been worn thin for years, and nobody had replaced it because replacement seals on Route 63 waited behind other priorities. He felt it on his arms and on the left side of his neck. He did not feel heroic. He felt cold. He was also aware, with the particular awareness of a person who knows exactly how institutional systems function, that what he had just done was going to appear in a report. An unscheduled stop at a non-designated location. Failure to collect fare. Operator exiting vehicle during an active route. 3 separate line items under the CTA operating rules. He knew the rules. He had known them when he pulled the lever. He had pulled it anyway because he had looked at her hand on her stomach and remembered the shape of being 7 years old and watching warmth move past him without stopping. 7 minutes into the ride, Zariah spoke. She did not turn her head. She spoke toward the window, quiet, almost to herself. "Thank you." Otis looked at her in the rearview mirror, the jacket around her shoulders, both hands on her stomach. He said she did not have to thank him. She was quiet for a moment, then, still watching the city through the glass. People keep saying that, but nobody does it. He did not answer. He drove past 2 more stops, picked up a passenger at the next scheduled location, and continued south on Halstead while the snow came down in the steady way that means it is not going to stop anytime soon. 3 days passed. The snow melted to slush and the slush froze overnight, and the sidewalks in Woodlawn had that particular February texture, crunchy at the edges, treacherous in the middle, that Chicagoans recognize without needing to think about it. Otis had worked 2 more shifts in those 3 days, both uneventful, both on time. He had not told anyone at the depot what had happened on the 14th. He had not told anyone at all. He had gone home each night, eaten whatever was in the apartment, and sat at the kitchen table making a list of things he needed to do that week. In the same organized way he made lists of everything. He received the summons on February 17th. It came as a message from the depot supervisor's office. A printed note slid under the door of the driver's room at the start of his morning shift. The kind of note that has your name on it in the specific font that the CTA uses for administrative communications. and that everyone at the depot recognizes at a distance without having to read it. The note said to report to Raymond Birch's office at 8:30 a.m. Raymond Birch was 48 years old and had been the operations supervisor at the 77th Street Depot for 6 years. The same 6 years, though neither of them had ever remarked on the coincidence that Otis had been driving out of that depot. Raymond had a desk with a monitor and a stack of manila folders and a coffee mug that said something mildly ironic on it that had been given as a gift by someone who thought Raymond had a sense of humor about his job. Raymond did not have a sense of humor about his job. He had a sense of order about his job, which was different, and which meant that when a form existed, it was to be completed, and when a violation occurred, it was to be documented. And when a documentation crossed his desk, it required a response. There was a form on the desk when Otis came in. He could see his name printed at the top. Incident Report number 63-0214. Operator, Calloway Otis J. Badge 3901. Date, February 14. Raymond did not greet him. He read the report out loud because reading it out loud was the procedure when an operator was called in for a disciplinary review, and Raymond was meticulous about procedure. 3 violations. First, unscheduled stop at a non-designated passenger location. CTA Operating Rules, Article 7, Section 4. Second, failure to collect required passenger fare. Revenue Policy, Article 4, Section 1. Third, operator exiting vehicle during an active route. Safety Code, Section 2, Subsection 9. Raymond looked up from the paper. He asked Otis if he had anything to say in response. Otis said, "There was a pregnant woman standing in the snow. I stopped." Raymond leaned back in his chair. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that happens when a person has heard something they did not expect and is making a decision about whether to engage with it or simply process it as context and move on. He moved on. He explained that CTA policy on these matters was clear and that clarity was not incidental. It existed because the system needed to function consistently across several hundred operators and several hundred routes and several 100,000 daily riders. An individual operator judgment, however well-intentioned, created liability exposure and operational unpredictability. He mentioned a driver in Cleveland who had allowed a homeless man to sleep on his bus during a cold snap. Suspended. A driver in Milwaukee who had taken a stranded passenger home off route. Terminated. The policy existed, Raymond said, because the policy existed. Otis looked at him across the desk. He understood what Raymond was saying. He understood it completely, including the part that Raymond was not saying, which was that Raymond was also following a set of procedures that he had not written and was not empowered to rewrite on a Tuesday morning in a depot office on 77th Street. "I understand," Otis said. He said it without anger and without performance. He said it the way a person says something when they have decided that the understanding changes nothing about what they did. Raymond set the termination paperwork on the desk. Otis signed it. He collected his locker contents, a spare uniform shirt, a phone charger, a small notebook, and he walked out of the depot into the February air. He did not have a jacket. His jacket was somewhere on the south side of Chicago, keeping someone warm. The form that had been on Raymond Birch's desk, Incident Report number 63-0214, had been filed by Floyd Emmett. This required some understanding. Floyd had not filed the report out of malice. Floyd was not, as has been established, a cruel man. Floyd had filed the report because Floyd was the kind of person who had spent 14 years building his professional identity out of procedural compliance. And when someone else violated the procedure, particularly on his route, on his schedule, in the time slot that had been his until he ended his shift early, the filing of a report was not a punitive act. It was a structural one. The procedure had a mechanism for addressing violations. The mechanism was the form. Floyd used the mechanism the way Floyd used everything, precisely and without particularly thinking about what it felt like from the other side. He had filled in all the fields. He had signed it. He had put it in the supervisor's inbox at the end of his shift on the 14th. 3 days later, Otis was out of a job. The apartment on the south side of Woodlawn where Otis lived was a one-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building that had been constructed in the 1960s and had received the minimum necessary maintenance in the decades since. The rent was $675 a month. He had $340 in his checking account, which was $22 more than he usually had at this point in the month, because he had picked up the extra call-in shift. The same shift that had led to the stop on the 14th. The same stop that had produced the incident report. The same incident report that was now the reason he did not have a job. He sat at the kitchen table. He got out his notebook, the same one he used for everything, bought from the dollar store on Cottage Grove, wide-ruled, 80 pages. He turned to a fresh page. He made a list. At the top, he wrote, "Things to do this week." Below that, in 2 columns, one for job applications, one for follow-up dates. He listed 14 positions: warehouse work, delivery routes, a facilities job at a school on the west side, a loading dock position near Midway Airport. He organized the list by proximity to public transit because he no longer had a vehicle, and the bus schedule in his neighborhood was something he understood with professional-grade familiarity, including its gaps. He did not write anything about the termination in the notebook. The termination was a fact. He had written down enough facts for 1 week. His neighbor, a retired electrician named Elijah Marsh, who lived 2 doors down and who had known Otis for 3 of his 6 years in the building, knocked on the door that evening. Elijah had heard something through the walls. Not specific words, just the specific quality of silence that follows a bad day when a person is sitting at a table alone instead of doing anything in particular. Elijah was 64 and had seen enough of both kinds of silence to know the difference. Otis told him, briefly, what had happened. Elijah listened. He did not offer an opinion. When Otis finished, Elijah said he had $340 he was not using at the moment, and that Otis could have it without interest and pay it back whenever. Otis said he appreciated that. Elijah nodded and went back to his apartment. That was the whole conversation. That was how it was supposed to go. Now the professional escalation, the union. ATU Local 241 was the amalgamated transit union local that represented CTA operators at the 77th Street Depot and across the Chicago system. Under the collective bargaining agreement between ATU Local 241 and the Chicago Transit Authority, a terminated operator had 14 calendar days from the date of termination to file an appeal through the union grievance process. Otis's termination date was February 17th. His window closed on March 3rd. He contacted the union office on February 19th. The representative he was assigned was a man named Fletcher Wald, 40 years in the union, the kind of person who had seen every variation of every situation at least twice, and whose advice was always accurate and always delivered without softening. Fletcher looked at the incident report. He looked at the 3 violations. He said, "These are documented. The policy language is clear. And while there was merit to an appeal on humanitarian grounds, the contractual standard for reinstatement required demonstrating that the discipline was not consistent with the written rules. And in this case, the written rules were unambiguous. That does not mean we do not file," Fletcher said. "It means we file knowing what we are filing." Otis said he understood. He wanted to file. Fletcher said he had 14 days to submit the grievance form. Otis said he knew. Fletcher said he would draft it. The grievance was filed on February 21st. The CTA's Labor Relations Office had 30 days to respond. The clock started. Meanwhile, in the 3rd row of Floyd Emmett's bus on the afternoon of February 14th, Tamika Sewell had not slept well since the night it happened. She replayed it with the involuntary precision that the mind applies to things it has not finished processing. The card failing, the beep, the coins, the belly pressing against the coat, the door opening, the cold, her mouth opening, her mouth closing, the door closing, the taillights. She was 38 years old and worked at an administrative office near downtown, and she took Route 63 twice a day, and she had taken it for 4 years. And she had been on that specific bus on that specific afternoon with 75 cents in her coat pocket and a word ready on her tongue, and she had not said it. And that fact, small, specific, 75 cents large, had lodged in her chest in a way that ordinary regret does not usually lodge. Because ordinary regret softens at the edges after a few days, and this one had not softened at all. She knew the bus number. She had looked at it. She was the kind of person who noticed details and filed them away automatically, the way some people photograph things and some people write things down. Unit 2847. She knew the date. She knew the time, 4:49 p.m. 3 weeks after February 14th, on a Thursday evening after her children were in bed, Tamika sat at her kitchen table and typed a request under the Illinois Freedom of Information Act, 5 ILCS 140, to the Chicago Transit Authority's records office. She requested any incident reports, operator records, or dispatch logs related to Unit 2847 on the date of February 14th. She submitted the request electronically at 9:17 p.m. and then closed her laptop and went to bed. The legal response time for a government agency under the Illinois FOIA was 5 business days for an acknowledgement and 10 additional business days for the records themselves, unless an extension was required. The CTA acknowledged receipt in 4 days. The records arrived on February 28th, 14 days after the incident. Tamika opened the envelope at her kitchen table on the morning of March 1st. Inside was a 3-page packet of documents. The first page was a cover letter from the CTA records office. The second page was the dispatch log for Unit 2847 on February 14th, which confirmed what she already knew. Departure from 55th and Halsted at 4:49 p.m. The third page was Incident Report number 63-0214. Operator, Calloway, Otis J. Badge, 3901. Violations, 3 counts. Disposition, terminated. Effective February 17th. She read it twice. Then she read the disposition line a third time, with her finger under the words. Terminated, because he stopped the bus. Because he gave someone his jacket. She sat with that for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called the Southside Courier. The Southside Courier was not the Tribune. It was not the Sun-Times. It was a community paper, 12 pages on a good week, operating out of a rented suite above a dry cleaner on Cottage Grove, staffed by 4 people, 2 of whom were part-time. Its circulation was approximately 4,000, which in publishing terms was not a large number, but in community terms meant that 4,000 people in a specific geography were reading it, which was not nothing. The reporter who picked up the phone was named Micah Aldridge. He was 29, had a degree in journalism from DePaul, and had taken the position at the Courier 14 months ago after 18 months of applying to larger outlets and not getting responses. He had not come to terms with the Courier yet. He was still in the phase of the job where you learn whether you are going to become the kind of journalist who stays at a small paper because you believe in local accountability, or the kind who stays because you stop sending applications. He was learning which kind he was. Tamika told him the story. She told him all of it. Floyd Emmett, the fair, the coins, the door, her silence. Then she told him about Unit 2847 and the FOIA documents and what she had found when the packet arrived. Micah listened. He asked 3 questions. Did she have the documents? Would she share them? And had she identified the operator who had been terminated? She had the documents. She would share them. She had identified the operator, Otis Jerome Calloway, badge 3901, 6 years on Route 63, terminated February 17th. Micah hung up, sat for a moment, and then called the CTA communications office for comment on the incident report. The communications officer said the CTA did not discuss personnel matters and referred him to the publicly available operating rules. Micah thanked her and asked a follow-up. Was there any formal mechanism within CTA policy for an operator to exercise humanitarian discretion in situations involving medical need? The communications officer said she would look into it and get back to him. She did not get back to him. He ran the story in the Courier's March 7th edition. Page 6, 450 words, no photograph, headline, Southside driver fired after stopping for pregnant woman in snow. The story included the violation details, the fare amount, the temperature on the night of February 14th, and a single quote from Tamika Sewell. He did the right thing, and the system punished him for it, which Tamika had approved word for word before publication. The story was 450 words on page 6 of a 12-page community paper with 4,000 readers. One of those 4,000 readers was a woman named Priscilla Vance. Priscilla was a member of the Chicago City Council, representing a South Side ward, and she read the Courier every week, partly because it was her district and partly because the Courier had covered her community forum on transit equity 3 months earlier in a piece that was longer and more accurate than anything the Tribune had run on the subject. She read the story about Otis Calloway over her coffee on the morning of March 7th. She set the paper down. She picked it up again. She read the violation line items a second time. She called her legislative aide and asked one question. Was there a provision in the CTA's current operating rules for operator humanitarian discretion in passenger medical situations? The answer, after the aide checked, was no. There was not. Priscilla Vance set an appointment with the CTA board liaison for the following week. She did not announce this publicly. She just put it in her calendar. Back at the ATU Local 241 office, Fletcher Wald had submitted the grievance on February 21st. The CTA's Labor Relations Office was required to respond within 30 days. On March 20th, 27 days into the window, the CTA's response arrived. It affirmed the termination. The violations were documented, the policy was clear, and the authorities' position was that the operator had been given appropriate due process through the disciplinary review on February 17th. Fletcher called Otis with the response. He read the key language over the phone. Then he said, "You have the right to escalate to a neutral arbitration panel under Section 12 of the Collective Bargaining Agreement. The arbitration request has to be filed within 21 days of this response." Otis said, "How long does arbitration take?" Fletcher said, 3 to 8 months, depending on the panel's calendar and whether either side requests continuances. Otis said, "And the likelihood of reinstatement?" Fletcher was quiet for 1 second, the specific 1-second pause of a person deciding how accurate to be. Under the written rules, low. Under a humanitarian argument, the panel has latitude, but they use it inconsistently. I have seen 3 similar cases. 2 ended in reinstatement with back pay. 1 did not. Otis said, "File it." Fletcher filed the arbitration request on April 8th, within the 21-day window. The arbitration panel assignment came back in 6 weeks. The hearing was scheduled for October, 7 months away. In the meantime, Otis worked. He had been hired in March as a driver for a medical supply delivery company operating out of a facility near Midway Airport. The pay was $11 below what the CTA had paid him. There were no benefits. He drove a white cargo van through the same South Side neighborhoods he had driven Route 63 through, delivering oxygen equipment and mobility aids and wound care supplies to home addresses. And he navigated the same streets and knew, without looking it up, where the hospital had closed, where the bus stop had no shelter, where the distances between need and service were longest. He was learning this geography in a new way now, not from above through a bus windshield, but from street level, front door by front door. He kept his notebook current. The job application list from February had been resolved. He had crossed off 14 entries, some with a notation that said, "Called back," and one with the entry for the delivery company, which he had circled. The pages after that were different. They were not job lists. They were something else. Names, addresses, appointment times, the same kinds of details he had tracked about his regulars on Route 63, but organized differently, more granularly, with notes beside each entry about the type of appointment, the transit access, and the gap between what the bus could reliably deliver and what the appointment required. He had started writing things down because he could not stop noticing them. And once he had written them down, he could not stop thinking about them in a particular way. The way you think about something when you have assembled enough data points that they start to suggest a pattern. And the pattern starts to suggest a question. And the question starts to suggest a possible answer. He was not ready to name the answer yet. He was still in the part where you notice things and write them down and let the notebook do the work of holding what you cannot yet act on. Zariah was in her final clinical rotation at the Woodlawn Community Health Center. She had found out about the Courier article on the morning of March 8th. A classmate in her nursing program had sent her the link to the digital version with a short message that just said, "Is this the bus?" She had read the article at the bus stop, standing in the cold, waiting for her first connection of the morning. She had read it twice. Then she had opened her own notebook, the same one she had used since the start of the pregnancy, the same one where she had written, "Refused," and the bus number, and the time, and she had found the page from February 14th. Unit 2847, Operator Calloway, Otis J. Badge 3901. Terminated. Effective February 17th. Because he stopped. Because he gave her the jacket she was wearing right now. She stood at the bus stop in the morning cold, with one hand on her stomach, and the article open on her phone, and the notebook open in her other hand. And she did not move for a long time. She did not know yet what she was going to do about it. She knew only that she was going to do something, because the alternative, reading the article and closing her phone and going back to the business of her day, was the same choice that Tamika Sewell had made on Floyd Emmett's bus in February, and she had seen what that choice cost a person. She put the notebook back in her pocket. She put her phone in her bag. She pressed her hand against her stomach, where the baby moved in the steady, reassuring way it had been moving for weeks now. A kick, and then a pause, and then a smaller kick, like it was testing something and making notes of its own. The bus came. She got on. She paid the fare. She had already started thinking about what she was going to say. If you have stayed with this story this far, you already understand what it is about. It is not about one bus on one night. It is about what it costs a person to stop, and what it costs everyone else when nobody does. Like this video if you believe that matters, and stay with us for what happens next. The article in the Southside Courier ran 450 words. Page 6, no photograph, but Micah Aldridge had done one thing beyond the word count that would matter later. He had sent a copy by email to every member of the Chicago City Council representing Southside wards. 3 did not open it. 1 opened it, read the subject line, and moved it to a folder labeled Constituent Concerns. 1 read it twice over her morning coffee and then called her legislative aide and asked a single question. That was Councilwoman Priscilla Vance. And the question was, does the CTA currently have any formal provision allowing an operator to exercise humanitarian discretion in a passenger medical situation? The aide checked the publicly available CTA operating rules, the current ATU Local 241 collective bargaining agreement, and the CTA's own passenger service policy documents. She came back the same afternoon. The answer was no. There was no such provision. There had never been a formal review of whether one should exist. The closest the documentation came was a vague clause in the passenger services manual about operators using professional judgment in emergency situations. But the word emergency was defined so narrowly, immediate threat to life or property, that a 7 months pregnant woman standing in 19-degree snow with 75 cents missing from her fare did not qualify under any reasonable reading of the language. Priscilla Vance scheduled a meeting with the CTA board liaison for March 14th. She also made a call to the Illinois Nurses Association because she wanted someone in the room who could speak to the health dimension of what had happened on February 14th, specifically to what it means for a pregnant woman in the 3rd trimester to stand unprotected in sub-freezing temperatures after a failed transit connection. The INA connected her to a maternal fetal medicine specialist at the University of Illinois at Chicago, who confirmed in writing that extended cold exposure in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy carries documented risks including elevated blood pressure, reduced placental blood flow, and increased probability of preterm labor. The specialist agreed to submit a brief written statement for the record. None of this was moving fast. That was the nature of the process. Raymond Birch was still at his desk at the 77th Street Depot. Floyd Emmett was still running Route 63 on time. The union arbitration hearing was 7 months away. And Otis Calloway was driving a white delivery van through the same neighborhoods he had spent 6 years navigating by bus, delivering oxygen equipment and wound care supplies, and writing names in a notebook. The names were the thing that had shifted. He had started the list in February, after the termination, as a way of tracking his job applications, a practical document organized because organization was the way Otis processed things he could not control. But somewhere in March, the list had changed purpose. He had started adding a different kind of name, not employers, patients. People he encountered in the delivery work who mentioned, sometimes in passing, sometimes at length, that they had missed a medical appointment because the bus had not shown up, or that they were managing a chronic condition under the constraint of a transit system that did not reliably connect them to the facilities that were supposed to be managing it with them. He did not ask people to tell him these things. He was a delivery driver. He knocked, he handed over the equipment, he asked if they needed anything else before he left. But in the specific geography of Woodlawn and Englewood and the blocks around 55th and Halstead, people told him things the way people tell things to a person who is clearly paying attention. And Otis was clearly paying attention. He always had been. By the end of March, he had 11 names. By mid-April, 19. Each entry included the person's name, their address, the medical facility they needed to reach, the bus route that was supposed to serve that corridor, the average wait time, and a note about what had happened when the connection failed. The notes were spare. He was not writing a report. He was writing a map of a problem he had been looking at from one angle for 6 years and was now seeing from a different one. He did not know what to do with the map yet. He was still in the part where you notice things and write them down. That changed on a Thursday morning in June when Otis pulled up to the Woodlawn Community Health Center in Elijah's old Buick. He had borrowed it for the morning to drive a patient to a dialysis appointment because his delivery route did not start until noon, and walked around to the passenger side to help the woman get out. Her name was Mrs. Ada Gibbon. She was 68 years old, came in for blood pressure monitoring every 2 weeks, and had missed her previous appointment because Route 63 had been delayed by a reroute near Garfield, and the clinic had given her slot away. She stepped out slowly, one hand on his arm, adjusting her bag. He did not rush her. He stood beside the car with both hands ready, patient in the specific way that comes from 6 years of waiting the extra 3 seconds for people to settle before pulling the doors closed. He did not notice the woman standing at the clinic entrance watching him. Zariah noticed him first. She had been a clinical rotation nurse at the Woodlawn Community Health Center since April, working the intake desk 3 mornings a week and assisting with prenatal appointments in the afternoons. She had graduated from Malcolm X College in May. The degree was in her bag the morning she walked into the clinic for her first shift, because there had been no ceremony worth attending, and the paper itself was the only part that mattered. Zora was 2 months old. She came to work in a cotton sling against Zariah's chest on the days when the daycare arrangements fell through, which in April happened more often than not. She was standing at the clinic entrance because Mrs. Given had called ahead to say she was running a few minutes late, and Zariah had stepped outside to watch for her. When she saw the Buick pull up, she looked at the driver the way she looked at everything around the clinic, with the particular attention she had developed over 6 years of having to track every variable in her own life just to stay on schedule. She did not recognize his face. She had never seen it clearly. In February, it had been dark and snowing, and she had been looking down at the sidewalk, then at the shoulders of a man giving her a jacket, then at the back of his head through the windshield. She had not memorized a face. She had memorized a posture. The way a person stands when they are not in a hurry because they have decided that the person in front of them is not a task to be completed, but a person to be attended to. That posture. She recognized it before she recognized anything else. He turned away from Mrs. Given and saw Zariah standing at the entrance. He looked at her. He did not recognize her either. Why would he? She was one passenger on one evening on a route he had not driven in 4 months. But then his eyes moved from her face downward to the jacket she was wearing over her scrub top. Navy blue, CTA issue, 3 sizes too large. The sleeves rolled twice at the wrist. He stopped. She said, "You stopped the bus." He said, "You kept the jacket." She said, "You gave it away without asking if you'd get it back." Neither of them moved. Then Zariah shifted the sling slightly, and he saw what was inside it. A baby, 2 months old, asleep with both fists curled against her chest like small, emphatic punctuation marks. She said, "This is Zora." He looked at the baby for a long time, then quietly, almost to himself, "She looks warm." Those 2 words landed between them in a way that neither of them could have fully explained. She looks warm. It was the most compressed version of every decision that had led to this moment. The jacket, the stop, the report, the termination, the delivery van, the notebook full of names, and this specific Thursday morning outside this specific clinic. She looks warm. The loop closed without ceremony, the way the most important things tend to close. She asked him what had happened after that night. He told her. All of it. Raymond's office, the 3 violations, the paper he signed, the walk out of the depot without a jacket, the $340 and the $675 rent, Elijah's loan, the delivery job at $11 less per hour with no benefits, the 14 job applications, and the notebook of names that had started as a list of employers and had become something else entirely. She listened the way she listened to patients describing symptoms, without interrupting, without reorganizing her face into an expression of sympathy that would require her to stop actually hearing. When he finished, she said, "They fired you for stopping." He said, "They fired me for stopping where I was not supposed to stop." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You stopped exactly where you were supposed to stop. They just did not have a sign there." She asked him about the notebook. He described it. She asked if she could see it. He got it from the car, a spiral-bound notebook from the dollar store on Cottage Grove, wide-ruled, now more than half full. She opened it. She read the entries. She stopped on the 3rd name. Mrs. Ada Given. She looked up. Mrs. Given had already gone inside. She looked back at the notebook. The 4th entry, Patrice Williams. She knew that name from the intake files. The 5th, a teenager named Devin, who had missed a placement exam because his transfer had not connected. She did not know Devin yet, but she recognized the pattern. 3 of the 19 names in his notebook were patients at this clinic. He had been tracking the same gap She had been watching from the other side of the desk, and neither of them had known the other was looking. She told him the clinic had no transportation budget. He said he had no budget at all. She said she had read about federal models for this: community health transportation programs, grant funding through federal health agencies, organizational frameworks tested in other cities. She said that the Woodlawn Clinic's director had mentioned twice in staff meetings that missed appointment rates were a documented problem, and that someone needed to figure out the transportation piece. He listened to all of it. Then he said he had never formalized anything in his life. He had spent 41 years doing things because they needed doing, not because there was a structure built around the doing. He said this not as a refusal, but as a fact, the honest description of the only way he had ever known how to work. She looked at him steadily. You would not have to do it alone. He looked back at her for a moment. Nobody had said that to him before. Not because people had not cared. Elijah had lent him money without being asked, and that was its own kind of saying it. But nobody had stood close enough to the specific problem he was standing in to say those words in a way that was practical rather than consoling. He called his mother that night. Lorraine picked up on the first ring. She was in the kitchen in East St. Louis, drinking tea from the mug with the chipped handle that she had kept for 12 years because it held heat better than the others. He told her everything: the clinic, Zariah, Zora, the notebook, the conversation outside the entrance. He told her the nurse wanted to build something real, and that 3 of the names in his list were already her patients. Lorraine listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You gave that jacket away in February, and it is still keeping somebody warm in June." He said that was one way to look at it. She said, "That is not a jacket, Otis. That is a direction." They built it in 3 months. Zariah wrote the proposal at her kitchen table in Roslyn, with Zora in the bassinet beside her, and her nursing textbooks stacked under the laptop for height. She had never written a grant application before. She learned the way she learned everything, by reading what other people had done, then doing it herself, then correcting the mistakes as they appeared. She found federal models: a non-emergency medical transportation program in Michigan, a volunteer driver network in Missouri, a community health shuttle consortium in Georgia that had reduced missed appointment rates by 31% in its first operating year. She built the proposal from the ground up: volunteer drivers, privately donated vehicles, a dispatch system to be operated from a room the clinic director agreed to provide, cost per ride estimated at less than 1/3 of what a non-emergency medical transport company would bill for the same trip. Otis recruited the drivers. He started with 4 people: neighbors, people from Elijah's building, a retired mail carrier named Samuel who had a clean record, and a car that ran in 2 free mornings a week. Each of them had something Otis recognized as essential: time that was not accounted for, and the specific willingness to use it for something that did not pay, because the something mattered more than the pay. Elijah drove on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He took Mrs. Gibbon to dialysis. He did not charge. He did not log it as anything official. He just showed up at her building at 8:45 a.m., helped her into the car, and drove her to the clinic the same way Otis had driven her that first morning, without rushing, without checking his phone, with both hands ready. They called the program Route Home. The name was Otis's idea. He said it one evening when Zariah was reading the draft proposal back to him over the phone and had left a blank line where the program name was supposed to go. She had asked what they should call it. He had been quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Every route should take you somewhere you need to be." She had written it down: Route Home. She had not changed it. The grant application went in on June 30th. The funding decision was expected in September. In the meantime, the program ran on borrowed cars and Elijah's gas money and Zariah's evenings at the kitchen table coordinating the schedule in the same compact handwriting she had used to write bus numbers and transfer times into her spiral notebook for the past year. The arbitration hearing for Otis's termination was still on the calendar for October. Fletcher Wald from ATU Local 241 had submitted the formal grievance paperwork, and the CTA's Labor Relations Office had confirmed the hearing date. The panel would consist of 3 neutral arbitrators agreed upon by both parties. The standard for reinstatement under the collective bargaining agreement was that the discipline imposed was not consistent with the written rules or was disproportionate to the offense. Fletcher had told Otis plainly, the written rules were not on his side. The humanitarian argument was the only argument. Arbitrators used latitude on humanitarian grounds inconsistently. 2 of the last 3 comparable cases had resulted in reinstatement with back pay. 1 had not. Otis had said, file it, so it was filed. What neither Otis nor Fletcher knew in June was that Councilwoman Priscilla Vance had spent the spring building a case. She had met with the CTA board liaison in March. She had submitted a formal written inquiry asking the CTA to review its operating rules for the existence or absence of a humanitarian discretion provision. The CTA's response arrived in April. The authority's operating rules were reviewed on a scheduled cycle. The next review was planned for the following fiscal year, and any proposed amendments would need to go through the standard public comment and board approval process. The timeline was 12 to 18 months minimum. Vance had read the letter twice and then scheduled a public session of the City Council's Transit Committee for September. The same month, the arbitration hearing was scheduled, though the 2 proceedings were structurally unrelated. She wanted testimony on the record. She wanted the gap in the CTA's humanitarian discretion policy documented in a public forum, not just in an internal response letter. She contacted Micah Aldridge at the Southside Courier and told him the session date. She also, through a mutual contact at the clinic, made a quiet inquiry about whether Zariah Webb would be willing to appear and testify. Zariah said yes without deliberating. She had been waiting for a formal structure to say yes to since the morning she read the Courier article at the bus stop with her notebook open in one hand and the evidence of her own story printed in 450 words on her phone screen. The hearing was scheduled for September 11th. The location was room 400 at City Hall, a committee room on the 4th floor with 47 fixed seats, a table for the council members, a witness table facing them, and a transcript recorder who typed everything into the official record at approximately 90 words per minute. The room was not large. It was not designed for drama. It was designed for process. Zariah arrived at 8:50 a.m., 20 minutes before the session opened. She was wearing the CTA jacket over her scrubs. She had not planned that specifically. She wore the jacket most mornings because it was warm and because she had never found a reason not to. But when she looked in the mirror before leaving the apartment, she had understood that arriving in it was the accurate thing to do. Zora was with the daycare. Tamika Sewell was in the room, seated in the 3rd row of public seating, because Micah had called her after the Courier article ran, and she had asked to be notified of any formal proceedings. She was there now, with her hands folded in her lap, watching the room fill up. Otis was not there. His arbitration hearing was on October 3rd. That was a separate process. His presence here was not required and had not been requested. He was driving the delivery van on Halstead when the City Council committee session opened. The session was called to order at 9:15 a.m. Councilwoman Vance chaired it. She had 3 other committee members present. A CTA representative sat at a separate table to the left, with a legal pad and a pen, and the particular posture of an institutional representative who has been sent to a public forum and has been told to say as little as possible. The first witness was the maternal fetal medicine specialist from the University of Illinois at Chicago. She submitted her written statement for the record and read 2 paragraphs from it aloud, including the passage about documented risks of cold exposure in the 3rd trimester. The statement was entered as Exhibit A. The CTA representative did not cross-examine. The second witness was Tamika Sewell. She spoke for 4 minutes. She described February 14th in precise, short sentences. She described the card failing, and the coins, and the belly, and the snow. She described her own silence. She said, "I had 75 cents in my coat pocket. The fare was $2.25. I could have paid the difference. I did not. I want that in the record." The transcript recorder typed it. The CTA representative looked at his legal pad. The third witness was Zariah Webb. She sat at the witness table in the navy blue jacket with the CTA logo on the left breast pocket and stated her name for the record. Then she read from a document, not the one she had prepared herself, but the one that had arrived in the FOIA packet that Tamika had shared with Micah, and which Zariah had studied every line of since March. She read aloud, "Incident report number 63-0214. Operator, Calloway, Otis J., badge number 3901. Date, February 14th. Violations. 1. Unscheduled stop at a non-designated location, CTA Operating Rules Article 7, Section 4. 2. Failure to collect required passenger fare, Revenue Policy Article 4, Section 1. 3. Operator exiting vehicle during an active route, Safety Code Section 2, Subsection 9. Disposition, terminated. Effective February 17th. She set the paper down. She looked at the council members. She said, "On February 14th at approximately 5:03 p.m., at the corner of 55th and Halsted, the operator of Route 63 stopped the bus at a non-designated location, exited the vehicle in 19-degree weather without his jacket, placed that jacket on my shoulders, and walked me onto the bus. I was 7 months pregnant. My Ventra card had insufficient funds. I had been standing at that stop for 14 minutes. The bus that came before his, the scheduled bus, running on time, had already left me there." She paused, not for effect. She paused because she was reading from her notebook and had reached the end of the page, and she took a moment to find the next one. The operator who stopped was terminated 3 days later for the 3 violations I just read into the record. He had been with the CTA for 6 years with no prior disciplinary action. He has not been reinstated. My daughter was born 2 months after that night. She is 4 months old. The jacket is the one I am wearing. The room was quiet. The kind of quiet that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that nobody in the room has the words for yet. Councilwoman Vance asked one question. She asked whether, in Zariah's view, the CTA's operating rules should include a formal provision allowing operators to exercise humanitarian discretion in situations involving documented medical need. Zariah said, "I think the question you are really asking is whether the system should be able to tell the difference between a rule being broken and a person being helped. Those are 2 different things. Right now, the system cannot tell the difference. The incident report proves that." The CTA representative cleared his throat. He said the authority valued its operators and its passengers and was committed to reviewing its policies through established channels. He said the timeline for such a review was 12 to 18 months. Councilwoman Vance looked at him. She said she understood the timeline. She said she was formally requesting that the CTA provide a written status update to the Transit Committee within 60 days, confirming that the review had been initiated and that the humanitarian discretion provision would be included as a specific agenda item in the next operating rules revision cycle. She said that request was now in the public record. The CTA representative wrote something on his legal pad. The session was adjourned at 11:40 a.m. Micah Aldridge filed his story that afternoon. It was longer than the March piece, 800 words, page 1, with a photograph of the empty chair at the witness table because Zariah had asked him not to photograph her. The headline read, "City Council hears testimony on CTA driver fired for stopping in snowstorm for pregnant woman." The story was picked up by the Tribune the following morning, which used a slightly different headline and credited the Courier in the 14th paragraph. The arbitration hearing for Otis Calloway took place on October 3rd, in a neutral meeting room at a downtown office building on South Michigan Avenue. The panel was 3 arbitrators, an attorney, a retired labor relations officer, and a former transit authority employee from a different city. Fletcher Wald presented the case for reinstatement. The CTA's Labor Council presented the case for upholding the termination. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Both sides submitted documentary evidence. The panel asked questions. There was no drama. There were no speeches. There was only the record, the incident report, the operating rules, the 6-year employment history with no prior violations, and Fletcher's humanitarian argument, which he made in precise, technical language that cited 2 previous arbitration decisions in the transit sector, where operators had been reinstated on similar grounds. The panel deliberated for 18 days. The decision arrived by certified mail to Fletcher's office on October 21st. Fletcher called Otis at 2:14 p.m. Otis was in the delivery van on the corner of 63rd and Ashland, parked with the engine running, eating a sandwich. He picked up the phone. Fletcher read the decision. The panel had voted 2-1. The termination was upheld. The reasoning was in the document. The violations were clearly established. The policy language was unambiguous. And while the panel acknowledged the humanitarian circumstances of the incident and noted them as a factor that should inform future policy review, the existing rules as written did not support reinstatement. The dissenting arbitrator had written a separate opinion, noting that the absence of a humanitarian discretion provision in CTA operating rules represented a gap that created precisely this kind of outcome, and that the termination, while technically defensible, was not what a reasonable operator policy should produce. Fletcher said, "The dissent is useful. It goes on record. It can be cited in the policy review." Otis said, "I know." Fletcher said, "I am sorry, Otis." Otis said he appreciated everything Fletcher had done. He meant it. He ended the call and sat in the van on 63rd and Ashland and looked at the intersection for a while. The bus stop on the far corner, no shelter, just a pole and a sign, people standing in the October wind, waiting for a bus that was running 4 minutes behind. He watched a young woman shift the bag on her shoulder and check her phone and look up the street and look back down at her phone. He finished his sandwich. He started the van. He pulled back into traffic. The Route Home grant application was approved in late October. The funding was $38,000 from a Federal Health Resources and Services Administration Community Health Access Grant, dispersed over 18 months. It was not a large amount. It covered basic operating costs, insurance for the volunteer vehicles, a part-time coordination stipend, and a small reserve for repairs. It was enough to make the program real in the way that something is real when it has a budget and a tax identification number and a liability policy and a whiteboard in a supply closet at the back of a community clinic. Zariah wrote the operating procedures in November. Otis organized the drivers. By December, Route Home had 6 volunteer drivers, 4 vehicles, and a dispatch schedule running out of the supply closet, which the clinic director had converted by moving 2 shelving units, installing a desk and a phone line, and hanging a whiteboard on the wall beside the door. On the whiteboard, in dry erase marker updated each morning, was the day's route list. Names, addresses, appointment times, drivers assigned. 8 runs on a good day, sometimes more. Before the whiteboard went up, Zariah took the CTA jacket off her shoulders and hung it on the hook beside the doorframe. She had worn it since February. She had worn it through the rest of the pregnancy, through the delivery, through the clinical rotation, through the grant application, through the city council hearing. She had washed it and pressed it and worn it the way you wear something that belongs to a moment you are not ready to put down. But the supply closet was warm. The program had a coat rack. And the jacket, navy blue, CTA issue, 6 years folded on a bus seat, and then 9 months on her shoulders, needed somewhere to belong that was larger than a person. She hung it on the hook. She stepped back. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went to her bag and took out the ultrasound photograph she had been carrying since April. The 8-week scan, the small white shape, the crease running through the center. She held it for a moment, then put it in the pocket of her scrubs. The jacket could belong to the room. The proof was hers to keep. The first month, Root Home served 47 patients. Mrs. Ada given to dialysis twice a week, every week, 0 missed appointments. Patrice Williams to the asthma clinic with her son. Samuel drove a man named Harold to the VA on Tuesdays. A teenage girl named Alani, 17, asthma and a custody case that required in-person court appearances and a bus transfer that did not reliably connect, was driven to 3 separate appointments in December without missing one. The missed appointment rate at the Woodlawn Community Health Center dropped by 22% in the first month of operation. That number, 22%, appeared in Micah Aldridge's January story in the Southside Courier, which ran on page 1 above the fold. He had asked the clinic director for the data, and the director had provided it, and Micah had verified it with the clinic's intake records before publishing. The story was accurate and specific and credited no one in particular because the story was not about individuals. It was about a logistics problem that had been treated, finally, as a logistics problem rather than a personal failure. Floyd Emmett read the January story in the break room at the 77th Street Depot on a Thursday morning. He was on a late start, first run at 9 a.m., and he had come in early the way he always came in early, because running on time starts before you sit down in the seat. He read the story while his coffee cooled. He read it to the end. He set the paper down on the table. The seat beside the driver's seat on his bus was empty, the way it had always been empty. He did not call the clinic. He did not write anything. He got up, rinsed his mug, and went to prepare for his first run. Some people hear about the thing they could have prevented and feel something. Others hear about it and turn the page. Floyd turned the page. That was its own kind of fact. Not the most important fact, but a real one. And one that did not change what Root Home was doing on the South Side, regardless of whether the man who had helped make it necessary ever felt the weight of that. In February, 1 year after the 14th, the CTA board received the first status update on the operating rules review from its policy committee. The update confirmed that the review had been initiated per Councilwoman Vance's formal request. It confirmed that a humanitarian discretion provision was included as a specific agenda item. It noted that the public comment period would open in March, and that a board vote was anticipated no earlier than the following summer. The timeline was 12 to 18 months from initiation. In other words, the process was moving. Slowly in the way of institutions, which move the way glaciers move, so gradually that you cannot watch it happening, only see the evidence of where it has been. Otis received a letter at his apartment in Woodlawn on the 14th of February, the 1-year mark. The envelope had no return address. The handwriting on the front was not familiar. Inside was $340 in cash and a small piece of paper. The paper had 4 words written on it. The words were, "You just did not walk past." He did not know who had sent it. He thought about Tamika Sewell, who had been at the city council hearing and who had Micah's contact information, and who had, 3 times now, found ways to put herself in the path of this story as a kind of ongoing corrective to the decision she had made on Floyd Emmett's bus. He thought it might be her. He could not be sure. The envelope went into a kitchen drawer. The $340 went into the Root Home operating fund, because he could not think of a better use for money that had arrived without asking to be spent on himself. On a Tuesday morning in October, 8 months later, 20 months after the 14th, Otis drove one of the Root Home cars past the bus stop at 55th and Halstead. He was running a morning route, Mrs. given to dialysis, 2 other patients to a clinic on the west side. He slowed for the light at 55th and looked at the stop. There was a shelter there now, glass panels on 3 sides, a bench, a corrugated metal overhang that blocked the rain and the wind, and in February, the snow. The CTA had installed it 6 months earlier, after a community petition with 400 signatures, approximately half of which had been collected by patients at the Woodlawn Community Health Center, some of whom had spent years standing at that pole in whatever the sky was doing, and had finally found a moment when someone in a position to change it was also in a position to hear them. Otis stopped the car. He looked at the shelter. He looked at the bench. He looked at the pole in the center of it. Still the same pole, the same sign zip-tied at chest height, the paint on the Route 63 number still peeling at the edges. He looked at the space where Zariah had been standing, where he had walked toward her, where he had put the jacket on her shoulders in 19-degree air and felt the cold settle immediately on his arms and the side of his neck. The shelter had not been there when it mattered. It was there now. He sat with that for a moment. The difference between fixing something and preventing it. The difference between a shelter installed 8 months after the fact and a shelter that would have been there on February 14th. Both were real. The gap between them was also real, and it was where people stood in whatever the sky was doing while the city figured out that they mattered enough to cover. He drove on. He was not extraordinary. He had not changed the system. He had not passed a law. He had not delivered a speech or appeared on a stage or made a statement for cameras. He had stopped a bus. He had taken off a jacket. He had walked toward a person standing in the cold. That decision had cost him the pension he had been building toward for 6 years, and it had become the foundation of the only work that had ever felt like it was exactly where he was supposed to be. Mrs. Gibbon was waiting at her door when he pulled up, bag in hand, coat buttoned, ready. She did not keep people waiting. He got out of the car. He walked around. He opened the door. He stood beside it while she settled in, without rushing, without checking his phone, with the particular steadiness of a person who has decided that the person in front of him is not a task to be completed. He had learned this from his mother, from the sentence that lived in the walls of the house in East St. Louis, from a woman in a blue coat he had never been able to name, from a pregnant stranger standing at a pole in the snow, from everyone who had ever stopped when they did not have to, and had proved, in the stopping, that stopping was always possible. He closed the door gently. He walked back around to the driver's side. He got in. He put the car in drive. He looked at the clock, 8:47 a.m., 2 minutes ahead of schedule. He did not look at the clock again. Somewhere across the city, in the supply closet at the back of the Woodlawn Community Health Center, a jacket hung on a hook beside a whiteboard, covered in names and times and the specific evidence that 47 people had gotten to where they needed to be this month. The jacket smelled like 6 years of honest work and 9 months of something that had no name yet. Nobody moved it. Nobody asked about it. It was simply there. Navy blue, slightly faded at the collar, sleeves worn thin at the elbows from 6 years of being folded and unfolded on a bus seat that no one had ever thought to assign a purpose to. Until the one evening it was needed. And in the back of a filing cabinet in the CTA Policy Committee's office at headquarters on Randolph Street, there was a folder labeled Operating Rules Review, Cycle 14. Inside the folder was a single agenda item marked Pending Public Comment, Proposed Amendment to CTA Operating Rules Article 7, to include a humanitarian discretion provision for operators in documented medical need situations. Below it was a note, handwritten in the margin by the committee chair. See Arbitration Dissent, October Panel. Useful language. The public comment period was opening in March. Whether the amendment would pass, whether the board would vote for it, whether the vote would come before the summer or after it, whether the language would be strong enough to mean anything the next time a driver had to decide whether to stop, none of that was settled. None of it was guaranteed. The institution was moving the way institutions move, and in the meantime, people were still standing at bus stops in the winter with not quite enough, and the buses were still sometimes late, and the distance between need and access was still, in too many places, exactly the length of a route that did not quite connect. But the hearing was on the record. The data was in the courier. The shelter was standing at 55th and Halsted. The jacket was on the hook. And on a Tuesday morning in October, 47 people had gotten to where they needed to be. That was not the whole story. It was the part of the story that was true today. The part that was still being written had no ending yet, only a direction. And somewhere in a drawer in an apartment in Woodlawn, an envelope with no return address and $340 gone, and a piece of paper with 4 words on it. The paper was still in the drawer. Otis had not thrown it away. He had not framed it or shown it to anyone. He had just put it in the drawer, the way you put something that is true and small and does not need to be performed. You just did not walk past. There was also, in the CTA's internal email system, a thread that nobody outside the policy committee had seen yet. The subject line was, RE Unit 2847, Policy Review Correspondence. The thread had 7 messages. The last one, sent on a Wednesday afternoon in November, from Raymond Birch at the 77th Street Depot to the Policy Committee's administrative coordinator, was 2 lines long. The body of that message had been redacted in full in the FOIA documents that Tamika had received. A solid black rectangle where the words had been. The subject line was visible. The sender was visible. The date was visible. The content was not. No one had explained why. A man stopped a bus where he was not supposed to stop. He took off the only jacket he had in 19-degree cold. He placed it on a stranger's shoulders, and he lost his job for it. There is no hero in this story. There are only choices, and the distance between the person who sees someone standing in the snow and keeps driving and the person who pulls over. Tamika had 75 cents in her coat pocket. She knew it. She opened her mouth and closed it, and she lived with that decision long enough to eventually stand before a city council and say the truth into the official record. That is also a kind of stopping, even when it is late. The lesson is not to become extraordinary. The lesson is this: you have already been on that bus. You have already watched a door close on someone. The question is not whether you would stop. The question is whether you will stop the next time. Because there is always a next time. There is always someone standing in the cold, and there is always a jacket, in some form, waiting to be given away. If this story stayed with you, like this video and subscribe. We tell stories like this one every week because the world needs more people willing to stop.